Something seems to have happened to time today. And I realized that the desire to narrate one's own Mosse stories contributes to that, including my own might-have-been story. So what do? We'll take another 5 minutes? Whatever's okay. So I will also try to be brief, even though these are such really extraordinarily stimulating papers. But reading them, I think, and trying to think about them, two things struck me as particularly interesting for discussion that we could have. And the first is, and this actually relates to what Enzo was talking about in the last panel, it seems to me that it becomes particularly clear in Lou and Elissa's work that we really should have changed the title of the panel to Nationalism, Violence, Total War, and Imperialism, or Colonialism, a category that, as Enzo pointed out, is not really present in Mosse's suggestive analysis of how, quote, the alliance between nationalism and respectability now moved towards its culmination as an alliance between nationalism, racism, and respectability, nationalism and sexuality. Secondly, and here is, I think, I hope, where Steph's paper, with its rather different intellectual, cultural history approach, speaks to Lou and Elissa's, is that I think that in our ever more specialized research worlds, it's actually very difficult, at least for me, in this comment also, very difficult to integrate the breadth, the kind of breadth that Mossian and other sort of intellectual and cultural analyses have with the kind of sort of very archivally based social and political history that we've also heard today. And of course, it would be very interesting to think about how we could integrate those in ways that I think has not yet happened. So let me just, a few points about the papers. Lou's trenchant analysis of the different ways that rape by American servicemen were perceived in England and France according to the fate of the nation in which they were committed can be seen, I think, as part of an increasingly visible imperial turn in studies of World War II and the Holocaust. Younger scholars with facility in non-European languages especially are investigating much more seriously the simultaneity of anti-colonial struggles, the fraying of empires in France and Great Britain, at the same time that the Allies are battling to defeat the Nazis, and that the Allies themselves, especially the Soviets and the Americans, of course, constitute a form of empire as well. So I think that's a context in which we need to think here at this conference as well. Lou points out that the charges against black soldiers were based on little evidence, inadequately investigated, and shaped by racist assumptions about black men, as were, indeed, for example, the accusations of against Red Army soldiers, which disproportionately involved Mongols rather than European areas of the USSR, which is what I had worked on. The British reaction, namely to see the, after all, non-combat allied American invaders as savages prone to racism and a tendency towards sexual violence, was surely, and I would love to hear more about this, was surely an expression of the anxieties of an empire that had, of course, as Lou pointed out, produced more than its own share of racism and sexual violence. And there are so many ironies in the story you tell, of which the most obvious one is that, after all, the English women who were part of this advanced civilization were the ones who were actually making the rape accusations. So we would want to talk more about that and how that worked. In any case, the imperial, and not just nationalist, the imperial, I would insert it, you say it, the imperial rhetoric of savagery, as Lou says, shows how deeply the discourses and practices of empire and imperialism shaped the greatest generation and the Allied effort to defeat Nazi barbarism. The Allies were, of course, entirely compromised by their own very differently, and again, we need to think about that, differently constructed racial policies and practices, a point firmly understood, for example, by African Americans in the United States, whose leadership called for a double V campaign against both Jim Crow and fascism, and maybe, again, to think about, with similar political gymnastics, working, for example, certainly working in India, or for that matter, with Zionists in Palestine, posed to liberate themselves from British mandate control and committed to defeating the Nazis. So, something to think about. And if, again, for Lou, if we think of the British as victorious and the French as prostate, thereby accounting for some of the differences in public reaction, I would want to ask, but don't we need to think about this heroic island kingdom as also profoundly vulnerable, at exactly that point, profoundly vulnerable, as its empire, over which the sun had never set, was everywhere being challenged. In India, in Palestine, in Africa, and also facing competition, certainly in Europe and the Middle East, from the Americans. So I think Lou's paper underscores the way in which the politics, anxieties of empire have to be linked much more closely than we have in the past. And of course, we already heard about the missing pieces in Mosse, to the trajectory, and other historians of his generation, to the trajectory of war and Holocaust and the emerging politics of the Cold War and the rise of the American empire, all of this linked to the unrest of decolonization, which I think also means that we have to work on a kind of rethinking of how we understand the term race, obviously different in different parts of, in the colonies, in the US, in Nazi Europe, and how racialized violence operated and was perceived in different ways by its victims and perpetrators in the US, in colonies, and wartime Europe. And then in relation to the racial policies of National Socialism, would also be very interesting to look back to events that fit better, perhaps, into Mosse's analysis of nationalism, racism, and sexuality, namely the Black Horror on the Rhine, Die Schwarze Schmach, which represented the Treaty of Shame, the German humiliation after World War I, and was also, of course, all about French Empire and the racism of imperialism. And then finally, and I know you know this, but it would be really wonderful, you didn't have time for this, to know more from the voices of the raped women themselves and the framework within which they were making their accusations and their own understandings, as inchoate as they might have been, of precisely nation, empire, and races. Because after all, no matter what the public discourse was, these were concrete women who were in fact agents in the story, whether as fraternizers, victims of sexual violence, and the accusers, often of African American men. Speaking of concrete women with limited agency, but nonetheless making consequential choices, Elissa's paper takes us from the relatively benign side of wartime Britain, occupied only by its overfed, oversexed, and overhere allies, to the heart of the Nazi empire and women's role in maintaining it. Her shocking story of sexual assault or attempted sexual assault by SS men on female Nazi guards inside a crematorium is also for her a story of ordinary women seeking upward mobility in a Männerstaat. But, and I just want to press on this for a minute, you asked the not at all deceptively simple question, how did they do it? In some ways, I think your question is not so different in investigation than the one Stefanie Schuler proposed in her paper yesterday, in which we didn't have time to discuss, about the respectable Dresden policeman tormenting elderly Jewish women. Why? How, but also, yes, why? So there's still, for me, something missing in the paper, and I think it might be found in a kind of productive conversation between what Stefanie was talking about and Elissa. Because after all, these women may have been ordinary, but seeking upward mobility, stability, but they were also all socialized in a National Socialist world of hate propaganda. We heard about against the Spanish Civil War, anti-Semitic processions, race defilement trials, the rituals of Rassenschande and anti-Polish campaign. And that must have left its traces in their choices to seek, of all places, this upward mobility, stability, and adventure, and I do think adventure is important, but I'll leave that part out, in Nazi death and concentration camps. So that a search for a kind of respectability in the Nazi universe for all these things, decent wages, actually, sort of shows that they were, I think, a kind of some, not Wendy Lauer's female furies, but some combination of the reworked new woman of the 20s, seekers of respectable stability, but also willing participants in the grand project of Nazi conquest. So that I wonder here whether a kind of history of emotions, what kind of incitement and excitement being part of that imperial program actually brought, and maybe that would bring us further. You talked about the references to colonial entitlement. That brings us back to Lou's paper around the ubiquity of colonialist discourses and practices. And so I wonder, what would a post-colonial analysis of women and gender in National Socialism look like? And I have one more question, which is I just would be interested in thinking about the opportunities not only for heterosexual sex in this wild East where rules were loosened, but also same-sex entanglements, if that's even possible to discover. And as I was trying to sort of figure out my discomfort still with this explanation of ordinary women, it occurred to me that maybe one place that I wanted to be able to ask George Mosse more about his acquaintance, I don't know what the right word is, acquaintance with Albert Speer, a man who, after all, also in different ways went to great lengths to dissociate his work from, and his ambition, from the horrors it facilitated. Someone who also did not want to get his hands dirty. And I'm wondering what that might reveal if we had that conversation. Maybe we'll hear more about that at lunch. And then then finally, Steph, on this biomedical language of politics and economics, it just raises again for me the question about the presence or absence of Foucault in Mosse's oeuvre, which after all, Foucault published in 1976. And I'm really sort of, given my own limits, I'm sort of understanding Steph's discussion of medicalization and the body as sort of so key to the progressive social health politics of the Weimar Republic. Medicalization was, after all, a means for people to control the biological tragedy, if you will, the kind of catastrophe of women, when, in fact, it was so important for women to be healthy so that they could succor the wounded and vulnerable men after World War I. So rationalizers were committed to order, regulation, integration, better to manage and regulate problems such as abortion or homosexuality than to criminalize them. And in some ways, the right-wing men like Tavelites, for example, as well as Nazi thugs, were also seeking to contain their violence into acceptable sanctioned forms. So I think we need to bring in this focus on the Volkskörper as well as the Volksgesellschaft. And then just, you in your written paper, but you brought us very much to the present, talking about the attack now on whatever we have left or ever had of this always selective welfare state. And you talked about the fact that Mosse was, quote, very economical in his use of the term crisis, which I thought was very interesting. And of course, I think all of us are wondering whether it now is the time to jettison that very economical use of the term and actually invoke it. Okay.